So the main two topics we'll be getting into today, or there are going to be three that we'll touch on a bit. The first one is going to be bunker placement. The second one is going to be sculpting. And the third is going to be just touching very briefly on bunker shapes. First thing we have to talk about would be placement, and two things with this. The first portion on bunker placement, this is about kind of the distance they are away from other features on the course. I made a little bit of an example here where we can kind of look at a couple things. This is something that a lot of newer designers tend to struggle with. In particular, I think it's a little more common for designers to put their bunkers, the bunker surfaces themselves, a little bit too close to the edge of the green. Let me just think quickly. Do I need my controller for any of this? I do not, so I can disconnect, put the mouse back in. There we go. So there's two things. I just made this bunker real quick as a quick demonstration at one point. It wasn't specifically about anything. Then I also made, this is the more important thing here, this little green site. This is a relatively basic green site, but it's in a decent spot. The land kind of leads towards it reasonably well. Here, this way, the way the back stuff kind of sets up nicely for a frame. The stuff in here. But I wanted to talk about one main topic. Near greens and other features in general, a lot of times designers put the bunkers a little bit too close. This I would consider a relatively good distance. You don't always want to go so much just by measuring. It's more so how your sculpting around the bunker lip interacts with the green. That's a topic we're not going to go so in depth on today, but I just want to give you guys a little bit of a primer as to how this changes when you're moving stuff. So I'm going to just move this bunker a little bit closer to the green. And you can see immediately that with where this green sits, we're going to have a very difficult time getting this bunker's lip to sit properly with the green. The bunker's going to need a little bit of space to do its own thing. The green's not going to help. If it's a little too far, we have the opposite issue. And some of this stuff, I think actually it might have been an ordering mistake to do this first. But later on, getting a little farther on in this, you will see why. Yeah, so you have to do area select like that and then move. There are a couple key things to keep in mind. Actually, I will go off on a tangent and mention this now. It is that if you're using this function and you're rotating an object, note that the bunkers, so let's highlight it, click to move. If you rotate, the brushes themselves will maintain their orientation. It's hard to see when they're circles, so maybe for that it's better if I just do this real quick. Give me the right code, please. Thank you. Let's just take this. This is the kind of stuff I've been doing on my current fictional course. We'll just add in some points here, enough so that you can get a sense. Good enough. So now if we move this shape, I'm also okay doing this. Every once in a while this happens. The thing glitches, it goes really wide after you've been moving stuff. When we move this bunker, now we see when we're rotating, the shape becomes an absolute mess. It does not maintain at all. So all these brushes maintain their directional orientation. No, that's totally fine. This was something good to mention anyway that I would want to before the tools portion, or as part of the tools portion. So this is totally fine. Very good question, or very good comment. What you said reminded me to examine that. But anyway, so we looked at bunker too close here. Bunker too far, got all this potential dead space in here. Now you can do that, but when you're sculpting it, you're probably going to have the bunker lip more in here. And then there's going to be some space in between the green that you're going to have to fill either with the way it's sculpted or maybe with some fairway or both. That kind of interaction we will get to later on. Just wanted to point out that this distance, it's a little harder to make this bunker work as is. If you have it kind of in the middle, now I hit 4. Wrong button again. Sorry, guys. There. Again, Bob. Move that kind of back to here. Maybe I'll give a quick little demonstration. This is going to be nothing fantastic. I just want to show that with the bunker in the right place, it's not too hard to get this looking pretty good. And the bunker sculpting methods, do not worry about this. We're going to go into great detail on this stuff in the next part. Shape is not ideal. Let's say we go like this. That'll explain later on. This is for a complete rush job. It's starting to sit a little better with the green. It's just slightly up here. That is not a bad thing. We'll get into that more later on. Point in case, the distance your bunkers are away from other features is going to completely change the way the land interacts with the other surfaces themselves. So that's the first part. Then we're going to dip into placement now from a different perspective. As much as I want to keep this series focused generally on visuals and not so much whole designs and strategy, I don't think there's any escaping it for this part. So I want to dip back in and start looking at a little bit of angles. Not going to get into this a ton, but just enough to pay attention to it from a designer's perspective and the way your hazard placement is going to change things up. Wants to go an okay example? You can use the unfinished wolfram miter. I think this is... I'll just go poke hole. So many options here. So obviously there are 3 general main uses for bunkers. The first one's obviously going to be greenside bunkers, and while sometimes you're just trying to get that to work with the land, when it comes to the hole as an entity, do not ignore greenside bunker placement. So this one's kind of simple. This green site, it slopes a little from left to right actually, and a little bit this way, away from these bunkers. But if we look at the strategy aspect, we can see the way this green side is angled, this edge, and where these bunkers are placed. What this means is if you're trying to approach this green, especially any pin tucked along the left side of this green, it's going to be a lot easier the closer you can get to this kind of angle. Whereas if you're approaching from here, you've got the bunkers as carry hazards. And then on top of that, the green is going to kick away from you slightly too. So that's kind of a little bit the idea of greenside bunker placement in terms of use as hazards. Then we can take that one step farther back, something this hole in particular does pretty well. So tee shot wise, you're mostly going to be landing between here and here, and we have one very annoying bunker right here, placed just to make your shot trying to get to that ideal angle more complicated. And the thing to notice here is that in both cases, these greenside bunkers are very much part of the visual too. And this fairway bunker here is very much part of the visual. It's kind of pointing up this way. But remember that first and foremost, they can fit with the land and help in the frame, but most bunkers are still there to be part of the whole strategy. I can look at this green here, and just by the shape of it, you may have a sense as to what comes into play for angles. Let's get the green grid going. Any shot back to this pin dropped directly over the top of this bunker is going to be kind of challenging. You can consider trying to play something from the left off of this slope or feeding it down this way, which will give you probably an easier shot execution-wise if your distance is off into that pin. So from here, have the option to play into here, let the ball funnel on down a bit. If we get to that hole purely from the right side of the fairway here, you've got a direct carry to the green, and this is not as easy to use as a backstop. If we look at this leftmost pin here, you've got a pretty severe green slope off the left side of this green. You are, relatively speaking, going to have a very difficult second shot if you try to approach a pin location over there from this side of the fairway. Not a lot of green to work with, and everything's going to slope pretty hard from left to right. In this case, you're better off trying to get over at the pin from this side of the fairway. And if you notice, there's another bunker here. This bunker is a little more of a carry hazard. Sometimes, depends on the club distance, and in this game not as much so. This bunker is more of a roll-in hazard. But if we look at it, this bunker is not a great example. It fits okay in the frame. It's kind of pointing this way. Doesn't fit with the land that well. Whereas this one over here, very much part of the frame kind of up this way. This bunker itself, if you notice, is stacking a little bit with this one. That is a topic that we'll cover relatively soon in the future of this series. So those are some ideas in terms of getting your green side bunkers and fairway bunker hazards all lining up. And then of course, the visual hazards. This points towards the green, and this one's also pointing towards the green. That's kind of how that works. The last main bunker thing would be framing bunkers. And these can sometimes be in play in fringe cases. They're placed very well especially. One example of a good framing bunker placement would be this one here. This bunker both acts almost as a carry hazard to this green. In terms of if you carry, you may be able to bounce the ball on, especially on a longer shot since this is a par 5. And if you look here, it kind of stacks again with the green. The green sits above and beyond it. So it's helping to frame this green and point in this direction, and it's very much in play. These bunkers here, these are more just for framing. These are there to be part of the visual. Although sometimes if you're really trying to lay back for a full shot in, which is probably rare the way people play this game, these bunkers can maybe come into play in a fringe case. These over here, these are pure framing bunkers. They will rarely come into play, only if you hook a shot pretty badly as a right-handed player. They're there mainly to be part of the visual, kind of bring things this way towards the green site. Then we have some other framing bunkers. We can look at this one right here. We have two main framing bunkers on this hole. This one here is kind of pushing up this way. As we can notice, it also fits very nicely into this land movement here. This is a pure framing bunker. This is just to make things look nicer and kind of bring things up this way towards where the green is at. And then this one out here is kind of more of a framing bunker than a hazard. Distance-wise, we are at about 330, I think. 325, 330 to the bunker. This is uphill. Only with the longest clubs and a strong tailwind will that bunker come into play. It is mainly just to sit there and be a nice part of this visual. Kind of sitting underneath these bunkers, boom. A lot of framing bunkers are for stacking. And I'll get into a little bit more on that later on. There's one last kind, well actually another couple kinds. These here sit in more from the side. Distance-wise, theoretically, they are at a potential layup distance, but this hole's short enough that you virtually never lay up. So they can come into play occasionally, especially if you're trying to work towards a back right pin. So you remember the angles? It's a little bit easier if we look at the way this green is contoured as well. You have a little bit easier of a time, not with how much this pin is tucked, but getting the ball into this back portion if you come in off the left and can use the slope a bit. I think it'll bring the ball back to around here. Last one is maybe everybody's favorite. It is the old top it, fuck you, or TIFU bunker. This right here, you can see the location. Nobody who strikes a decent quality golf shot, period, on a par 3 is going to find a bunker that is... how far in front? 50 yards in front of the tee. It is there purely to be part of the visual. And if we look from ground level, you can start to see a little bit of why it's actually there. It meshes reasonably well with these bunkers here and kind of stops what you can see. So you just see the fairway here kind of presents out this way towards where the green is. This gets in more to stacking. We'll have another visit on that later on. Go into more details. That is going to be 2 sections from now. That's another kind of framing bunker. Actually, there's one more kind. We have a little bit of the bridging framing bunkers. So this one in here, this middle bunker on the right-hand side is doing a little bit of this. Kind of goes here, following this one points a little this way. This one kind of just helps to bridge the gap towards the green. That's a big part of what stacking does. There's going to be a little more on discussing, how to set things up and that. And then these bunkers here are largely doing the same. This middle bunker on the left-hand side is more so just to kind of bridge the gap from here to there. And that should be it on this topic. This is a little bit on bunkers, where they're placed in terms of how they come into play, how they work as part of the visual. Next topic here, we're going to start to look at a couple things with bunker sculpting. So the first main thing about bunker sculpting, and this is relatively basic, but it's still important enough to reiterate so everybody hears it. The vast majority of bunkers have a high side and a low side. What I mean by that is they're kind of set so that the sand faces the player a little bit, but we can look at it this way. Low side, high side. The high side is a little bit of a hazard portion as well. We have to clear it. And if you have a very tall high side, you can start to limit what kind of club you can hit out of the bunker. So that becomes a more penalizing hazard. These here have the same thing as well. Low side, fairway, high side above. Same thing on these green side bunkers. This one not as much, but it still kind of has a little low spot here. And then these on 10 here. Low side, high side, low side, high side, or high and low, whichever way you want to look at it. On 6, we have the same thing, a little differently here. We kind of have general lower part here, upper part here, and the fingers are a little more of a high side as well. That's the first main thing to keep in mind with bunker sculpting. High side and low side applies to any style unless you're in a very particular spot. I think it was mainly Tillinghast and a little bit Emmett, Tillinghast in particular, who didn't always have bunkers with a high side to them as much, and it was more so if you have a bunker on the high side of a green, something much more specific. We might get to something like that later on in this series, but probably not. High side and low side. The next thing here is on the low sides of bunkers, a lot of the time the land kind of gently moves into them. This can be style dependent. Some bunkers will just have a greater height differential in general. We can see here it's relatively smooth, just kind of easing into the bunker. So low side, the land can kind of spill into it a little sometimes. And the high side, we can see this bunker is pushing the land out this way on the high side. This is a very important concept. The bunkers are really contributing to a lot of the land movement around them. And in many instances, the bunker is kind of moving the land. That's a big part of what goes on here. If we look at this one here, we can see a little bit the same. Kind of nice and low there. This high side, very much is pushing into the land this way. And these green side bunkers here, this is almost pushing into the green a little bit. Think about low side, high side, and low side. A little bit the same here. Up and into the land a little bit. Then here we even have a tail coming off this bunker. That's something we'll get into probably with the next portion. Some general detail sculpting with bunkers. The general idea here, the high side and low side, the way that works. And regardless of what you're doing, you want to try to tie the bunkers into the land. We can see here that here's a little low part, but the sculpting here still extends out beyond this bunker. Even out to here, the sculpting is a little bit influenced by the sand. This part here kind of sits with the sand a little bit. We already saw that part. This one here is a good example where the low side's very low, just kind of rolls in, spills into the bunker. And the high side, there's a little bit of a train piece coming off here, a bit of train movement. This part can maybe be done a little better than it is. But this high side is largely propping up this entire fairway contour. This is how much the land is tied into this bunker here. And if we look at this one over here, we see the same thing happening. This little ridge in the land is an extension of this bunker. And this bunker itself is pushing the land out on the high side, and the low side rolls in pretty gently. Same thing for this one here. Low side kind of rolls in. High side, it's starting to push into the green a little bit here. So that's the main point there. Another important thing with bunkers is that you want to keep the style for the course you're working on relatively consistent. It doesn't have to be crazy consistent, but I want to give you guys a quick example. That you don't want to have, say, kind of a more flash sand bunker like what I was just showing you. You don't want to have those kinds of bunker shapes with just like out of nowhere, just complete flat bottom grass wall bunkers. It's not going to mesh very well. You can have a little bit of variety, and we will look at that as well. For this part, let's see, where's this bunker? So I was kind of saying you can almost, if you look at the land here, this was unintentional, you can almost put a green off in here, kind of like this shape, around the bunker a bit, up through here. Something like that could be your green. It's always not perfect as is. But with this kind of bunker here, you don't want to do this. This is going to be fun. I'm not going to sculpt it perfectly. I'm just going to go for decent enough for this. You don't want to have that kind of bunker and then with and because of the way bunker math works in this game, which I will also be covering in the next portion, which is a refresher. This is obviously not finished, but you want to think twice before having a bunker like this in on the same course or right next to a bunker like this. It can be very hard to make these work together. The way the sculpting is just so different. So next I want to go step out of here and look at some real life photos. Duck into some bunker shapes a little bit. We're going to look at more sculpting examples first. Shapes we're not going to get into too much in this portion actually. I want to start touching on that a little bit more in the next one once we dig in with the tools. Done with Pasatiempo. Back to Cypress Point we go. Right off the bat on hole 2, we will find some very instructive bunker sculpting. Right here. Let's go a little closer. So the main things going on here, we can see this bunker, the terrain is kind of going up this way and out. Not necessarily running into the fairway that much here, but the low side is down almost to fairway level. Here, the low side of this bunker is again close to fairway level, but we have a couple things going on. These fingers are kind of all pushing up and out. The high side is moving the land. This in here falls in a little. This one in particular, kind of pointing straight this way towards where the green is at. And the land is being pushed quite severely, you can see. And also a little bit out this way. And out into here, you can see little bits of detail sculpting coming off these bunkers. This is helping to tie it into this greater area. So the bunker sculpting might really go all the way out to here, up to here, even like here. Or the stuff that's actually affected by the bunker sculpting. You want to think bigger and think outside just the bunker when you're sculpting them. If you think micro on these and just with the sand itself, it's going to lose some of that terrain flow aspect to it. I think there's one more. Might be worth showing hole 4. This part here. Is this better? This is fine. So we can see here, there's a low side. This part is high. It's pushing out into the land. Come a little bit closer. This part here, the sand is really headed out this way. This is one other thing I actually forgot to mention at this point, which is that for sand, for bunkers, there are 2 main general kind of style subsets, which are the grass wall and sand wall. And here, a lot of times with sand wall, you have the sand itself kind of doing most of the work, or it feels like it is. And then with more grass wall, or kind of more where the sculpting outside the bunker terrain is doing stuff, you have a little bit of that here. And this finger, just pure sand wall. The sand itself is kind of pushing out into the fairway here. And then this little bit of a finger coming out and into this land ridge here, which then goes seamlessly into the fairway. And this low part here coming off the bunkers does a little bit of the same, a little bit out into the fairway there. So that's just some general things to keep in mind with bunker sculpting. So the last thing I want to touch on real quick is going to be some stuff. Actually, I want to do something else with sand bunkers, which is mainly we've just looked at kind of more exaggerated styles. What I'm working on my current fictional course, Coca-Cola, any of Mackenzie's courses generally have this kind of bunker style. I want to look at a sand style with less exaggerated shapes to it, and for that, Tobacco Road is a good example. So this course we can see the sand itself very much kind of low side, high, low. And we see here very dramatic high side, way up. Pacific Dunes has a lot of this too, but it has much deeper bunkers on it. And we get into, now we're starting to look more at the actual sculpting in this one. You can see the way this finger is kind of pushing out and up into this green. It's moving the land. The green is just here. It doesn't stop the land from doing its thing. And then on number 1, this is just very extreme, not the best example. But this photo right here, these are kind of just ordinary bunkers. They're kind of, you see the low side and the high side. But you see the way here, they're all sitting in this land, which kind of comes up and over. The bunkers are pushing the land on the high side away from them. And then over on the side, it's spilling out a little bit and towards the fairway. We can see from here, the bunkers are very much just kind of leaning up and kind of almost putting a hand out and leaning on the terrain. That's generally what you want these kinds of bunker styles to do. So the Mackenzie stuff is very much the same way. You can think of it that way. In terms of shapes, there isn't too much to get into at this point. We're going to get a little more in depth with shapes next time. The main things to think about are generally where the shapes point, especially if they have fingers, and generally where the bunkers are placed and how they mesh with the terrain. First step would be getting the bunkers to mesh with the terrain, regardless of whether or not they fit into the frame how you want them to. So that would be where you want to start. And then I would say maybe then you can try some of these more wild bunker styles and work on getting them to do what you want. Next time we're going to get into more detail on those. I think that's everything that I have for this portion. So it's all about the way you sculpt the bunkers, what they do with the land. They push out, sometimes it goes in at the bottom. And the bunkers don't care what other surfaces are there with the land. They will still push the terrain, as you saw, was it these two? You have the green here, the bunker says, I don't care, it does what it needs to do, moves the terrain. And then this last one here, same thing. The bunker doesn't care if there's fairway on the other side or not. It's still going to move the terrain. And that's all I got for you guys. So, how is it going, Rocket? And for those of you who might have any questions, now would be a good time to ask. If there are no questions, that's totally okay as well. If there's any more specific sculpting related stuff, I would like to say ahead of time that it might be better to save that for a future part, or it might be best actually to ask me now and I could tell you if it's something that would be covered in the next part. Or if I wasn't planning on that, but it's worth looking at, I can include it. From what I was leaning or leading? I guess it's more leading, like for next time. I can give you a brief summary of some of what I have planned for next time. It's going to start with a general discussion of what the different aspects of the sculpting tools do. It was going to include quote-unquote bunker math, because we know the flattened brush does very weird things if you use it in sand in this game. Raised brush is normal. I was also going to discuss a couple other general things with plot macro sculpting, with camera view angles. And then I wanted to get into some bunker sculpting methods and some stuff to do with shapes and how to tie those in. And in terms of bunker sculpting, that's going to be a doozy. I got a lot of good stuff coming for you guys. I was going to go into a few different methods, in particular if you want to have designers to think of. Go ahead, Scotty. Bunkers on downslopes, like if the land is already kind of sloping away from you, it would mainly be you probably still want to build the bunker up a little bit anyway. Like landing areas that are downslopes. It also depends on how much it's sloping down. Because a lot of the time the bunker is kind of a bit of a stop, especially if you have it can be a little bit of a stop, especially if you have like a terrain ridge there. I might have been better off loading up Coca-Cola in this course. Maybe you can consider... Nah, this isn't so much a downslope. Do I have any that really are here? I don't know. Might have been incorrect to load up that course. The real main one for that here would just be like this on one. And I'm not sure how final it is. But here you can see it just kind of sits up and just way over the rest of this land. This is a bad lighting angle for it too. Actually, this might be a decent example. It's crazy over the top. I'm not saying you should go do this. Like, this might be the kind of thing you have to do on a pretty severe downslope. You can see here, the low side is like almost at fairway height at some points. The land's kind of moving into it this way. And this top part is very much spilling out into the fairway. But when it's this downhill, like, that's the kind of extent you might have to go to, unless you want to use small bunkers and kind of try to stack them in the downhill direction, which is a real pain. I have some on Coca-Cola that might be worth looking at. In particular, like the one on 13. It's not the greatest practice, but Coca-Cola has a bunch. I'd say the main thing is you can still have the bunker to the sand itself. It can still slope a little bit away, as long as it doesn't look like it is. Yeah, and that's also a huge bunker, but I wanted that one in particular. I don't love the execution, but I very much wanted it to be that, to hit to that left section of the fairway, it's blind over the bunker. And if you end up in the bunker, I mean, most of the time we'd probably be able to carry it, but you have a really, really bad angle. Excuse me, game. I was just lagging. So here in particular, 5 is not the greatest example. Those are more for framing. A lot of the time when they're off to the side, I think this could help a lot actually. Like, you see the way in this case, this is something I did a little too much of on this course. They kind of slope in towards the fairway. The terrain is a little bit bowled in, like B-O-W-L-E-D. This bunker is actually sloping a little downhill. It's still following the land. But this side here is up just slightly, so it still has your quote-unquote stereotypical bunker sculpting and terrain interactions in relation to what's going on here. So that would be the kind of thing I would say to keep in mind. And then 13 is a little bit of that too, I think. This one, it's actually sloping a little this way, but if you look from the tee here, it just looks like a normal bunker, this one. That's kind of what I would suggest. The one I showed you on my other course is a much more dramatic example. Not something I would necessarily recommend. I'm not even sure if I pulled it off very well myself. So for more specific bunker sculpting stuff, I want to tell you what's going to come up next time. I wanted to talk a little bit about each of these things with each method. How easy they are to do, like how much time it kind of takes to learn them with the tools and that kind of stuff. On both controller and mouse, because I've had experience on both of them now. While I mainly use mouse, I did spend probably 1,500 hours on controller, so I'm still reasonably proficient on that. Kind of how long they take, how tedious they are, and then what to do with the tools to achieve them. And I was going to start off with what Matt F does for bunkers, in terms of how he sculpts the land before. I've never really tried that, so it will be interesting to see how that goes. Then I'm going to touch on what B101 tends to do for bunkers. Generally like what Maddie from Canada did with good friendly reminder, Bundy. If anyone's designing right now and listening to this, friendly reminders to save. Especially if you're in an area with like a big snowstorm or potential power outage. So that's what I was going to do. Matt F first, B101. I want to get into a little bit of what Dylan does. I'm going to touch on what Joe Golfer G does. And also maybe some kind of general grass wall stuff. So all those different things for bunker sculpting style-wise, I wanted to touch on. So everybody kind of has an idea what to do and some different ways to use the tools to get those results you want. And I also wanted to go into some kind of alternative methods for, say, if you're on mouse trying to do one thing, where it might be a little harder than on controller, or especially for like what I do, which is kind of a variation of what Dylan does. a lot of that is really, really, really hard to do on controller, borderline on impossible without it just being downright impractical. So there are kind of some workarounds on controller that you can use to get a similar-ish result with a slightly different method. Like that kind of stuff I wanted to go into. And then just some other general stuff with the tools. Also open for questions. That's what I have in mind for next time. So I hope you guys have fun with that when it rolls around. That's going to be the end of this portion. And I will see you guys next time with part 7. It's going to be tools.